So, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer claims people smugglers will be treated like terrorists under his party's new migration plans if he was to win the next general election.
It could see people smugglers' movements restricted and assets frozen. Excuse my language. Sir Keir Starmer is live from The Hague. I'm going to talk about those plans in just a moment. I just want to address with you an issue we've been discussing this morning, which is about these two brave young women who went out in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer, Wayne Couzens. They were arrested by police, they were manhandled, they have received an apology and a compensation from the Met Police. But we read a statement from the Met this morning which says the actions of individual officers were found to have been appropriate. They acted in good faith, interpreting complex and changing legislation in challenging circumstances in a way that was entirely consistent with their colleagues working across London at the time. And we thought it was a typo. What do you make about the way that the Metropolitan Police has responded to this case, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions?
Well, yeah, no, thank you for that question. I remember profoundly seeing some of the footage coming out of that vigil at the time, and I think, like everybody else, I was really shocked by what I saw, and instinctively I thought, this is wrong, it's inappropriate, and it's disproportionate. Now, I accept that the police were policing in very difficult circumstances because we were in the middle of lockdown, there were conditions on people meeting, but I think anybody who saw that footage knew instinctively that it was wrong, it was disproportionate, and I think it would be better just to be clear about that this morning.
So you don't think that the actions, despite the statement from the Metropolitan Police, you don't think their actions were appropriate in those circumstances?
All my instincts told me at the time that they weren't, and nothing has changed my view on that. I think I do remember the footage. I remember it was looked at pretty widely, and I think everybody watching some of those young women being carted off in those circumstances thought this is wrong. Now, I do accept that it's always difficult to police situations like that. We were asking a lot of the police at the time in the pandemic, what judgment calls do they make? So, you know, I'm pretty generous in my interpretation to the police here, but I'm afraid my instinct at the time is exactly the same as my instinct at the time, which is this was wrong, it was disproportionate. And I do think it is probably better just to be clear about that today than to have slightly mixed messages.
Sir Keir Starmer, you're in The Hague today, talking tough on tackling illegal immigration. You would like to see, if Labour came into power, it being on a par with terrorism. Can you explain to our viewers how you see this working, how you're going to track down these people traffickers, how you're going to freeze their assets when they're so hard to find in the first place?
Yeah, I can do. Behind me is Europol. I think you can just about see the building here in The Hague. In that building are police teams from across different countries sharing intelligence, working out plans about how to deal with, in particular, terrorist gangs, drug gangs. Europol is alongside that. That's where prosecutors join them. When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I had staff in Eurojust, and we sat down and we took operational decisions. Where's the intelligence in relation to these gangs? How can we interrupt them, and how can we prosecute them? What I want to talk about today with Europol is how we do more of that in relation to the gangs that are running the vile trade of putting people into boats.
So can I just ask, are Europol not currently working with our government at all on this?
Yes, they are, but I think we need to go further, and that's why I say we've got to have an agreement in place, a security agreement that allows us to do a number of things, share intelligence in real time, that's vitally important, draw up joint operations, and I'm particularly interested in discussing today how we stop the boats getting in the water in the first place. Yeah. It's pretty clear to me from what I've seen and heard and read that the boats that are currently being used, they're bigger boats, as you know, holding about 50 to 80 people. They're being manufactured for this vile trade. They're being transported across several countries to that coast in France. We need to have an operation that intercepts that, smashes it, and brings these criminals to justice. And it's a mindset issue as much as anything. The reason that the operations here work so well is because they deal with terrorist cases. I think we need to put this vile trade, you know, putting people into boats, in the same sort of category so that it's dealt with as seriously.
Well,
so that rather than having, you know, gimmicks from the government about what we do when people are already in the UK, that we actually smash this and stop people getting into the water in the first place.
No one would argue that that's something that everybody would like to see. I think part of your proposed plans is that in return for being able to send back anybody that comes across the channel in a boat straight back to France, we would take our fair share of asylum seekers who were trying to come to Europe. What's the number that you would be happy to take?
Can I just clarify that?
Yes,
because there are two different stages here. The first stage is how do you work with police forces across countries to ensure that you stop people getting into the boats in the first place and smash this vile trade. And that is about working here in Europol, working across Europe, to ensure that the criminals are brought down, that they are treated in the same way that we treat terrorists. So that's stage one. The question of whether people can then be returned only applies if people are still getting across the channel. And what I want to do is to stop the trade, stop this vile business in the first place. But to answer your question, yes, of course, where people have got across, what we need to do is process their claims as quickly as possible. And where people are not allowed to stay in the UK, we need to return them. And at the moment, we've got a farcical situation where we've got tens of thousands of people in hotels waiting to be processed. Sometimes now these cases are taking up to 4 years and they're costing £2 billion to the taxpayer in hotel bills every year. That's not sustainable. But the discussions I'm having today are very much about the first stage, because I'm absolutely determined. Because I spent 5 years working with some of the police forces here, I know, I've seen this done and been part of the operations where terrorist gangs have been brought down. I want to see the same determination applied to this vile trade. And I absolutely, genuinely believe it can be done.
As does the Prime Minister, of course, as well. Now, look, you are in The Hague today. You're about to be meeting with Emmanuel Macron, leader of France. There's a very sort of European tone to your message. You want to work closer with Europol. You want to work with police forces across Europe. Is there a little sort of chink in the Brexity armour here, where perhaps our European counterparts think that if you did become Prime Minister, perhaps there's room for closer integration between the UK and the EU? Perhaps there could be more free movement between the UK and the EU?
Well, I can see why you're putting that point to me, but actually what
one of the reasons is it was on your pledge to be leader of the Labour Party. You wanted to defend free movement as we left the EU. Is it something you want to go back to?
Can I just complete on this? Because the operation to take down these criminal gangs has to be based on where they are. And they are operating across Europe. The boats are being made further away, sometimes outside Europe. They're transported across Europe and they're arriving in France. So it is inevitable, it's obvious, that if we're going to smash those gangs, we've got to work with our partner countries that are the place where these criminals are operating.
And the way we give our partner countries
operations work is that the key countries...
better cooperation?
For the cooperation here at Europol and Eurojust for policing operations, smashing the gangs, the cooperation has to be we share our intelligence in real time. We're prepared to pool decisions about where arrests take place, where the evidence is gathered, even where the prosecutions take place. I've been sitting in these buildings some years ago when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, making those decisions. Claims.
But what I'm asking is there an opportunity for you in the run-up to becoming what you want to be, which is Prime Minister of our country, that you might consider concessions to the EU, for instance, as you have set out in your 10 pledges on freedom of movement? I understand you want to stop the freedom of movement of illegal criminal gangs, but what about freedom of movement? Have you abandoned that pledge?
There is no return to freedom of movement. We have left the EU. There's no case for going back to the EU, no case for going into the single market or the customs union, and no freedom of movement. It's been really clear that that's the parameter. I do not accept that that prevents us working with other police units here, with prosecutors here, to smash the gangs in this vile trade. But to be clear, no return to freedom of movement and no going back into the EU. But it would be foolish to say, therefore, we won't work with other police forces to smash these criminal gangs. And I think everybody watching would say, look, for heaven's sake, if you can take these gangs out before they put people in the water, that has got to be a good thing.
And one last question before you go, because we've already seen that you've done the reverse ferret on the first pledge of your leadership, increase income tax for the top 5% of earners. But there is also this very sensitive issue of the two-child benefits cap. You have said that you will stick to that. It has earned you a very unpleasant name, Sir Keir Starmer. If we overturned the two-child benefit cap, we could, according to experts, lift 250,000 children out of poverty. Why won't you change your mind on that one?
Well, let me be very clear. We will have an anti-poverty strategy for an incoming Labour government, just as we had one under the last Labour government. But the decision I took in relation to two-benefit cap was a tough decision. It was made because I'm not prepared for the Labour Party to make unfunded commitments as we go into the election. We saw with Liz Truss.
In 2020, you said it should be scrapped, though, didn't you? In 2020, you did tweet that it should be scrapped.
Look, there are very strong feelings about this in the Labour Party. I completely accept that. That's why it was a very tough decision. But we saw just about a year ago with Liz Truss what happens when unfunded spending commitments are made. She wanted tax breaks, but it's the unfunding commitment that led to now, damage to the economy and people paying much more on their mortgages, etc. I'm not prepared to have an incoming Labour government put that burden on working people, because it's working people that pay the price when politicians make unfunded spending commitments. And so that's why I've taken what was a tough decision to deal with this. But I can say absolutely clearly and categorically, an incoming Labour government will have an anti-poverty strategy. And we, just as we did when we were last in power, we will lift people out of poverty. I'm absolutely determined to do that, but we will have to make tough decisions along the way.
Sir Keir Starmer, we're going to have to leave it there. We appreciate your time this morning. Thank you for joining us.